A lot of these questions are about singleness. So I feel like I threw a Molotov cocktail, and I'm just going to let you guys put out the fire now. The first question is this. What is your advice, and this is twofold, what is your advice to single women desiring to be married, and how can they prepare for marriage? And the follow-up is the same thing for single men.
I think one of you said it, is you make yourself marriageable. You get marriageable. What kind of guy do you want to marry? What kind of woman do you want to marry? And then what kind of woman would that guy want to marry, and what kind of guy would that woman want to marry? So you want to think in those terms, and as a godly single person, try to work and do what you can to develop those kinds of characteristics. And I mean, you said something about working out and just even physical things. So yeah, just do what you can, knowing that you can't do everything you'd like to see done, but you can do some things, and you ought to do them.
Well, I would say, yeah, that's good. And also to study, the young men should study the Bible when it talks about what young men should be like, say in the book of Proverbs. Make a list of those things and examine yourself and say, where do I need to grow to make myself to be more of a mature, godly young man? And then pray. Pray for a godly. I'm saying you're reformed because the Reformed is the best way of interpreting the Bible. You want a godly, reformed young woman that's also spiritually mature. And pray that God will enable you to meet that woman, and once you're convinced that you have met someone that could possibly be a partner for life, take action. You pray and then you act. You actually... And don't be embarrassed if you ask to go out with someone and she says no. It's not a repudiation of your person. She's just saying, I don't think you're the right one for me. It's not like she's the only woman in the whole world. Don't get so uptight about your own failure. But then you go back to prayer again, and you keep working on making yourself to be a more godly, potential, marriageable, that's a good word, person. And also for a young woman, I mean, do place yourself, do sign up for singles conferences, singles reformed conferences, and set yourself in the way. Use the means, and also be very prayerful. God can bring you the right man.
I would say too, for women, Proverbs also speaks a lot about the contrast between a foolish woman and a virtuous woman. And so make a study of that and find a virtuous woman that's older than you, that's a little bit further down the road, and see if she'll come alongside and encourage you in those areas.
Good.
I'd like to accentuate. Am I on?
You may have to push a button.
I'd just like to emphasize the part of prayer. I was single for most of my 20s, and I had quite the list of what I was looking for in a husband. And I think as a woman, the biblical model is that a woman does not take the lead, but there are ways you can be friendly. You can, again, to reinforce, make yourself marriageable and be as godly of a woman as you can, but prayer, because it's ultimately up to God to bring you that right person. And I had lofty goals, but God gave me even more than what I prayed for. I was praying for Mr. Right, and Reverend Right showed up. And I call him the BMW, the best man in the world. So we've been married almost 35 years, and it's been wonderful. And God answered those prayers for me in a way far beyond what I expected. But I have friends that are my age they're still single, and they wanted to be married every bit as much as I did. And so I look back on my single years, and I should have been more faithful. I should have had more faith, is what I mean to say, and just went out there and lived with gusto for God, and waited for Him to fulfill His will. in my life. So if you're a single young woman, just use your gifts and talents to His glory with a lot of energy, and pray that the right one will come along and meet you on the way. But pray that you'll recognize them too. Don't look for someone who's absolutely perfect, but pray that God will bring him into your life and that you'll have a beautiful marriage.
Very good. Well, along with that, another question on singleness, it is this. In singleness, how can one avoid the traps of bitterness and spiritual depression while desiring, expecting marriage, but feeling like it may never come to fruition? How can we know if marriage is an idol in our hearts?
That's very hard. It's hard. It's tough, but only God can give that peace and that Holy Spirit to work in your heart, to give you peace, not be bitter, and just pray for God to put that peace in your heart and joy.
But God has ways of breaking down everything in us that puts something above Himself. He knows He's a idol crashing God. He's crashed my idols in life. He's broken me. And I know what it is to be broken under those idols. But it's for your good. Just like training a child when he's very young. It's for their good. And so, as hard as it is, as soon as you put anything, think of Rachel. She put that desire for children above God, and God condemned her for it. As much as you long for marriage, it could be a holy longing, but don't let it replace God. First of all, if you're a Christian, you're married spiritually to God. That's the superlative marriage. And don't forget that. You have the richest marriage of all when you're married to God.
I think something you said, Graham, in your talk was very helpful, that we do hear from some sectors in the evangelical world today that if a single person wants to be married, then that's almost automatically assumed to be idolatry. And yet God did create us as His image bearers to be married. I mean, there are going to be exceptions, as you pointed out, but the norm is that. And there's nothing wrong with desiring that. So the desire is not sinful. It can become sinful whenever it takes on a life of its own and it becomes too important, and you get to where you're bitter against God and you are turning these desires that are good into something that is ultimate. And so that's a fight every Christian has all the time. We've got to constantly come back to what is ultimate in our lives, and that is Christ, what God's done for us in Christ. And so when you have something that you want that is good that you don't receive, well, that can be a trial. And singleness is a trial for many. And what do we do with trials? Well, we're to count it all joy. We are to remember the things that God's taught us and know that those things are still true in the midst of trials. He's still good. He's still wise. He's not forsaken us. He loves us. He's for us. He didn't spare His own Son. And so He's not going to withhold anything from us that is good. And so you can let those truths just saturate your heart and mind, your affections, as you have genuine desires, and pour those desires out to the Lord. Make them known to the Lord. Lord, I want to be married. It would be good and God-honoring to You, I believe, if I were married, but I trust You. And in one sense, that's the battle of every Christian all the time. But this is such an intimate, personal kind of right desire that it can feel overwhelming, and then you can get nervous about it and say, well, I just shouldn't want to be married. And that's not right either.
Yeah, David Paulson makes a good distinction between God's gifts and God Himself, and good gifts make bad gods. And if we try to turn the good gifts of God into God Himself, well, we're guilty of idolatry, and it does not go well. I'm reminded of Israel and Moses in the wilderness, and after Israel had rebelled, and God says, okay, fine, I'll let you go to the promised land, but I'm not going with you. I mean, what did Moses say? We'd rather be with you in the wilderness than go to the promised land without you. And it's better to have Christ in the wilderness than to go into the promised land without Him. It's better to have Christ in the wilderness of singleness and the pain of singleness than to have a spouse, have that good gift and elevate that good gift and replace Christ with that good gift. Because if you're in the promised land without Christ, you're in the wilderness. But if you're in the wilderness with Christ, you're in the promised land. Amen. Another good question, this is not on singleness, but on parenting. When parenting a strong-willed child who is disobeying, that never happens, does it? When parenting a strong-willed child who is disobeying, challenging instructions, and having outbursts, how does one know when to spank, when to put a child on timeout, and when to calmly soothe the child? I'm glad I'm asking the questions.
We had no strong-willed children, so I'm gonna...
Yeah.
I'd say start with calmly soothing. I call a loving straitjacket if they're throwing a temper tantrum. Just hold them and stay calm yourself so that you model how to react to strong emotions. And you can't do this, I love you. You can't do this, I love you. And just hold them while they're kicking and screaming and flailing. And that's one option. But incremental discipline also is another principle. Like the first infraction requires attention, but as they keep disobeying, it requires stronger discipline. So defiance is a bad one that has to be dealt with right away, and moral infractions require discipline. My husband likes to use the example of spilled milk is not a moral discipline, so that doesn't demand spanking, but a moral infraction does require discipline.
Yeah, I think it's an old book now, but it's still very useful. Shepherding a Child's Heart by Ted Tripp. Yeah, I read that book first when our oldest child was 3 years old, and we have. Well, let's use the word maintenance rather than strong-willed, in case people on tape or recording. We had a low-maintenance child, a mid-maintenance child, and a high-maintenance child. And I said to Mary more than once, I think God makes children so different in every family so that no parent ever feels like, hey, I can do this. And we need him. We need him for every child. I'm serious. And what works with one child doesn't often work with another child. So for one child, a timeout can be very effective. One child you can send to the bedroom for discipline, say, you've got to stay in your own room. The child goes and plays in there, is very content, there's no punishment at all. Another child just is chafing in there and feels the pain of what they've done. So we took Ted Tripp's book and we've kind of followed it, where you bring the child into a private room and then you explain to the child what they've done wrong, that you've been trying to correct the child, and it's time now for a spanking because God is not pleased with the sin and your dad is in the position of God to administer discipline. Lay them over your lap and you spank them. Say, this is a serious moral infraction. I would spank them maybe 3 times. Medium moral infraction I do twice. Smaller one I do once. And then pick the child up and embrace him and say, do you realize what you did wrong? Yes, okay. Are you sorry? Yes, okay. Well, then we're going to pray about it. And you pray. And you bring it to a closure, and you walk out of the room hand in hand. That's the way it should go. With one of our children, that worked like a charm. The other child was so tender, even if I went like that, the child would be a flood of tears. I could not spank that child very hard. It would have been cruel and unusual punishment. And then the third one is like, did that hurt? No. Okay? So you got to spank them harder. But it doesn't mean you always have to use the same method with each child. You have to be fair, but you have to give enough pain that it becomes a motivation for them to cease from that sin. Enough pain. Without ever leaving any marks on the body. Cannot physically abuse them. And when we discipline, we should never discipline with anger. Never with anger. We have to stay calm. If you're really mad, you're probably overly disciplined. If you're really mad, you want to say to your child, Daddy needs a little more time to think about exactly how to discipline you. Give me a little time, but we'll come back to visit this. And then you calm down. You calm down. And also discipline with humility. One thing that helps you not to over-discipline is to remember your own heart and your own depravity. Your heart's no different. Your heart's no better. And so come down on the level, in your mind, come down on the level of the child. Say, I'm doing this for the welfare of the child. And don't get so emotionally wrapped up in it that you get carried away.
I think, too, important is to make sure the child knows the expectation for their behavior in a calm time. So you're talking through it. This is what's expected of you. And be consistent. If it's not okay to throw a tantrum at home, it's not okay to throw a tantrum at church or in the grocery store. So that consistency, children need that. They need, they love boundaries. Just tell me what my boundaries are, so that I know how to move in them freely. And so couching it first in a very positive way of, these are your expectations. And then when you go back and revisit it and you're having that talk about time, it's not something new. You're springing on them. And you're not, and don't discipline them because they've embarrassed you. That's another. Yeah. If you're feeling embarrassed, get your heart right. And that's just a personal testimony. Get your heart right before you try to correct your child.
Yeah.
One of the things we tried to do is to distinguish, too, what's going on here. Is this a human issue? Is this a childish issue? Or is this a sinful issue? And if you've got a 3-year-old and you say, don't spill your milk, and the child starts to clap and spills the milk, okay, that's childishness. That's not sinfulness. But if you've got an 8-year-old and you say, don't spill your milk, and he looks at you and he takes his cup and he turns it upside down, okay, that's not childishness. That's not humanness. That's sinfulness. And that needs to be addressed on that basis. It's not always easy to know. And I think I would say now, as a grandfather, give the benefit of the doubt to your child. Be as patient as you can be in trying to make sure you're not misreading the situation, that this is just childishness. This isn't sin.
Connected to that, this next question, what differences or adaptations should be considered when disciplining and instructing your teenage children as opposed to their younger years?
Well, one of the things that's helped us is to realize the change in relationship with kids. When the kids come into the world, you're their commander. So you're it. If you don't feed them, they don't eat. You don't change them, they don't get changed. You don't pick them up, they don't get picked up. You're the commander. And then as they grow out of that into, 8, 9 years old, 10 years old or something. So that first phase, they need to learn how to obey you. Listen to my voice and obey. Just listen to my voice and obey. But as they get a little older, then you're like a coach to them. And so, what's a coach do? Well, a coach can't play the game for you, but a coach can tell you, go out there, don't take this shot, take that shot. And if they take this shot, the coach can pull you out of the game, put you on the bench. There's consequences for that, but it's not a commander. I can't physically force you to do that. This is a problem I think sometimes parents have, and I've struggled with it myself when our kids were young, is you think, I'm going to make my child do this. Well, you can't do that with a 16-year-old the way you can with a 5 or 6-year-old. And if you try, you're just buying trouble. You are going to set that child up for all kinds of rebelliousness. So be a coach to them. And then the other thing is once they become adults and they begin to kind of develop their own way of living, you're not a coach anymore, you're a consultant. And, consultants get to speak when they're invited in. And there's sometimes, we'll talk about situations that either our teenage kids or older kids will be facing. We'll think, this would be a good idea for them to do this. Or they'll be thinking about doing that. We say, we won't think it's a very good idea, but it's just a conversation between us. And until we are asked, we just try not to speak. Which is we don't always succeed in that, but we try not to speak. Or when we speak,
the facial expressions are harder.
Yeah, they are hard.
How many bad ideas do they have that you don't tell them about?
Oh my, no. Look.
Many of them are here tonight, so I'm sorry.
They had so many more better ideas than I ever had.
That's a good idea.
My dad had only an 8th grade education, but he was pretty wise in these areas. And I like what you just said a lot. these different stages. And when we got to be like 11, 12 years old, we come to him with a right or wrong question, or can we watch this movie at a friend's house or something? And he'd say, well, what do you think? And we'd say, well, yeah, maybe I better not, Dad. We were actually more hard on ourselves than he was. Or he'd say, why don't you go up to your bedroom, get on your knees, and ask the Lord if you could glorify Him by watching that movie. Well, that made us think too.
Yeah.
Like, there's going to be a lot of sin in that movie, and I can't glorify God in that. And so helping to form your conscience, right, by making you start thinking about what is right or wrong. Because if you keep forcing all your decisions on your children as they get older, as soon as they get out of the home, they're going to do their own will now. But what you want to do is you want to shape their conscience so that when they leave the home, they continue to do what is God's will, because their conscience has been taught. And then when they get married, my dad had this really nice saying too. He said, there comes a time when they get married and you're no longer the head of their new household, so you cannot give unsolicited advice. You can tell them, if you want advice, feel free to come to me. I'd love to give it to you. But there comes a time, he said, where you can't, especially a rebellious older child that's left the home, that you can't talk to that child so much about God as you used to, but you can still talk to God about the child. Amen. So you multiply your prayers for... I like to say to parents, when their child gets married, it's not that you're losing a child, you're gaining an additional child. So you need to take a step back, you can't interfere, and then a step down to pray and double your prayers, because now you've got an in-law to pray for as well.
I would say, too, with teenagers, there's a lot going on in the teenage body and in the teenage brain, and that needs to be taken into consideration. There's actually a reformation that goes on in their brain, which is why they a lot of times do really stupid things. It's just true. And then their whole bodies are just out of control. And so remember, too, you're preparing them to launch, as Tom said in his sermon this morning. So part of that is while they're in your home, it's good for them to feel the weight of consequences for their stupid actions while they're in the safety of your home. I'm not talking about reckless behavior. You know, if you hear your kid's been drinking, well, I guess if he gets behind the wheel, he may kill himself or kill somebody else. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about, you know, if they decide, trying to think of an example I haven't shared with anybody personally recently.
Can our kids just leave for a moment?
I'm not even talking about my kids, but current teenagers in the church whose moms I've talked to. You know, if they forget to wash the dirty dishes, well, they may see those dirty dishes in their bedroom or something, and they understand, okay.
How would they get there?
You have to deal with this. So there's a consequence to the choices that they're making, particularly in disobedience. So it's, you know, you're not going to turn my son quickly outgrew me. I couldn't physically spank him, and it wasn't appropriate.
No.
Yeah, so there had to be consequences, particularly for, you know, some of his disobedience. So we had to be creative. And it's different. Like you said, children are different. And so you just have to stay one step more clever than those teenagers. Not always easy.
Going back to the consistency thing, I think my technique, which I don't recommend, is to be patient, and then suddenly get frustrated and disgusted with their behavior. And if you set the rules, then stick by them. I just didn't want to administer that discipline, but eventually I had to. But you set the rules and administer the discipline. And also the consequences thing, like if they're late for assignments in school, don't try to keep hounding them and nagging them. Oh, come on, you got to get your assignment in. You're gonna get a failing grade. You're gonna get a 0. That's even worse than an E. And if they don't care, let them suffer the consequences.
Don't rescue them.
Like in the protection of your home, and then hopefully they learn those lessons so that they get rid of those behaviors at a younger age rather than when they're adults.
Here's a much simpler, straightforward question. It's not controversial at all. Should we send our children to public school?
No.
No.
Done.
I would say do anything in your power not to.
Yeah, no, it's
The state of the
inevitable
schools.
maybe for some, but those would be rare. I would work 3 jobs if I had to avoid that. And I know it's not possible for some. And where that's the case, then you've got to be involved. Our public school system is absolutely morally bankrupt. And there are good people in it, there are good Christian people in it, but the system is morally bankrupt. And so I would plead with any parent that, if at all possible, whatever you could possibly do to try to avoid that.
Especially if it's the United States of America.
Yeah.
There are places in the world where there are some public schools, like in Ireland, where a lot of the teachers are godly people, and they don't seem to have a lot of restrictions, and they really almost teach their kids like it is a Christian school, even though it's a public school. But America's, it's like pouring poison into you, not so much always by blatant teaching, but also by sins of omission, treating things without God in the picture. This is the worst thing you can do to a child, is to marginalize God or have him disappear altogether. And children need consistency. They need to see, in the Dutch tradition we call this a 3-legged stool in the Dutch language. The church and the Christian school or homeschool and the home. I guess if it's homeschool, it would be a 2-legged stool. But
That explains a lot.
All 3 things have to be consistent, right? And when children grow up in an environment where it's all consistent, even if they're not saved, even in their intellectual, historical knowledge, they tend to believe that these things are true. This is important.
I think it's harder, too, when you send your children to the government schools. You have to spend so much time unteaching what they're learning on a daily basis.
And the solemn thing is that since the parent, according to the Bible, is the primary teacher of the children, what you're really doing is you're loaning the child temporarily to the church to assist you. You're loaning the child to the school to assist you. If that school is teaching something contrary to the Word of God, you're held accountable.
Right, absolutely. Bodie Balcom says, don't send your children to Caesar and then be surprised when they come back as Romans.
Yeah.
This is a bit off topic of what we've been talking about, but are there any good book recommendations, maybe not even just on this topic, but that you have read recently that have been impactful for you? Maybe Dr. Beeke will limit you to 2. The rest of you, you're free to give any recommendations.
Tom's a reader, too.
On what?
On anything.
On anything? Yeah. Well, the book by Carrie Gress, on the end of woman. She's a Roman Catholic, but she has written on how the destruction of the patriarchy has destroyed women, and the idea of feminism and the rise of feminism. But prior to reading her book, I was pretty soft on first wave feminism. I thought, okay, women were repressed and they needed to get the vote and things. But she documents how the whole thing is demonic. I mean, demonically inspired, intentionally demonically inspired. And so I've been in the process these last 6 or 8 months or so rethinking just how deeply devilish feminism is. And that book's had a good impact on me.
It's for sale in the bookstore, by the way.
Well, recently I edited actually our last year's conference addresses, The Lord of Encouragement and Endurance. Suffering and the Sovereignty of God is the subtitle. And I don't know, I sat through all those addresses and I thought it was a good conference. But when I read the book, it was profound. There's some really good speakers, and it's just a 150-page read. But a book that really impacted me about a year ago was I edited for RHB the 144 sermons of Anthony Burgess on the Puritan on John 17, the high priestly prayer of Christ. That chapter in the Bible is a gold mine. It's like Jesus pulling back the curtain of the Holy of Holies. And Burgess says something like this, and allowing us into his private prayer life with his Father. This is sacred stuff, way beyond what we can imagine. But particularly about a couple hundred pages in that book, every phrase was 2 or 3 more sermons. But the whole section where Jesus talks about his intercession, oh, it was just heavenly stuff. And I've been meditating on that, preaching on that, thinking about that ever since. And that doctrine has become more and more precious to me. That Christ is interceding for you, dear believer, every single second of your life. Hebrews 7:25. He ever lives to make intercession for you. This is the Bible. Think about that. There's never a moment, there's never a second you're left alone. He's interceding for you. Now, in every trial, in your singleness. So once you grasp that, we ought to be able to bow under life's trials much easier and say, it's all in good hands. It's in my Savior's hands. So that's had a real impact on me. I think intercession of Christ is the most minimized doctrine in Reformed theology.
I think my all-time favorite is Disciplines of a Godly Woman by Barbara Hughes. It's just loaded with a lot of wonderful wisdom.
For me, just recently rereading large portions of Pilgrim's Progress to teach in our Pilgrim's Progress camp. And also, just in the topic we've been talking about, the Bad Therapy book. It's a secular book by Abigail Schreier. I can't remember what the subtitle is, but Why Our Children Aren't Growing Up. It's talking about a generation that's coming up with basically a mental health crisis. How you see a lot of, particularly the smartphone generation that have been raised with that, how anxiety has taken over their lives, and how so many of them are into mental health therapists and drugs and just difficulties in some of the generations coming up. It was a fascinating, insightful read from a secular perspective.
Yeah, I would co-sign that. Next question. With today's culture blurring the gender lines, it seems more important than ever to be very intentional about teaching our sons manliness and likewise godly womanhood to our daughters. What are practical ways you would suggest to parents to do these things?
One thing I did with my daughters in particular was conversations, intentional conversations at different stages in their lives, and then doing book studies with them. We went through Passion and Purity by Elizabeth Elliot, Let Me Be a Woman, also by Elizabeth Elliot. I'm trying to think some of the other titles I'm blanking out right now. And our agreement, we have 5 daughters and 1 son, and I was going to do the daughters, and Tom was going to do the son until Joel got to be a teenager, and he said, "Can we switch?" So you can handle that part.
Yeah, I read a book maybe a few months ago called Masculine Christianity by Zach Garris. It's very good. It wasn't specifically on manliness, but manliness is woven through in thinking about the Christian faith. And I'm reading one now. I hadn't quite finished it. It's called Honor Thy Fathers. He's a PCA elder, and it's very good. He does a lot of retrieval work from the Puritans and the Reformers, and just basically quotes them and ties it all together really well about what it means to be a man and to honor men and to honor the role of men in our churches, in our homes, and in our world. It's it's a short book, but it's very good.
We're editing. I'm actually editing a book right now with Paul Smalley called The Redeemed Man, and we look at 22 different areas of a young man's life. And Sinclair Ferguson's doing a chapter, Derek Thomas, and much. Are you doing a chapter?
Oh, no.
No?
I'm doing The Unredeemed Man.
No. No, I thought maybe you were. But anyway, but we've got a number of really, really good writers on this book. And we look at every area of how a man ought to really be We first were going to call it the reformed man, but we changed it to the redeemed man because we want people that also aren't reformed.
Yeah.
But the idea is that this Christian worldview that we embrace in the Reformed faith that is all comprehensive applies to every single area of life. So ultimately, I mean, giving books is good and reading books is good, but ultimately, next to the Bible, we as parents are the most important, our lives are the most important book our children will ever read. And we've got to model that in every area of life. And we can teach it and we must teach it, but it's one of those things that is better caught than taught. If children are surrounded by really godly women who really model the love of Christ, they will catch that. And if they're surrounded by masculine, God-fearing, biblical men who love Christ, they'll catch that.
One thing that's for sure is that we have to talk about this, about feminine roles and masculine roles, because it's been changing for a while, but I feel like in the last 5 years, I don't know if it was the pandemic or whatever, but it just seems like the world has kind of gone bonkers in the last 5 years or so, especially when it comes to gender roles and sexuality. So what we could have assumed before was that, women were women, men were men, and you could see a difference. You could see the roles just in culture, but that's not true anymore. So we have to talk about this. And we can't be embarrassed about God's design of men and women. We're different from each other. And we just have to have some real conversations with our kids about it and modeling it and maybe making sure they're exposed to other positive role models. But let's talk about these roles according to the Bible.
Amen. There's two good books on this. One is by Rosaria Butterfield called 5 Lies that I highly recommend. I don't know if we've got that one here or not, but it's on her further development in theologically understanding the life she came out of as a lesbian and this whole transgender movement. And then Voddie Baucham's newest book is called It's Not Like Being Black, which is the way that the movement wants to identify itself. This is a civil rights issue, and he argues very strongly, no, this is not a civil rights issue at all.
That book is in the bookstore. Now, to echo what you said, Mary, I mean, just being unembarrassed, unashamed to say, this is what women are like, this is what men are like. They're different by nature. It's not all about preferences and what the woman wants to do and what the man wants to do. I mean, my boys, we go outside, we work in the yard. They can barely hold on to a lawnmower, but they push along with me, And my daughter is going to learn how to do homework, and that's okay. And the boys help inside, and the girls can come outside and help too. But it's a very intentional understanding of the way that men and women are created differently. And another question here, kind of related to what you were talking about earlier, Donna, on bad therapy. Do you have counsel on kids and cell phones?
Yes, she does have counsel on kids and cell phones. Don't give them cell phones. That's right. No, I think cell phones are, it's one of those things that we've just kind of been lulled into our culture with, so that everybody has them now. And there have been all kind of studies done on this. Even in educational institutions, there are some schools now, universities, that will not let you use even a computer or a cell phone because it just affects the way you learn. But you think about this. This is the world. In about 30 seconds, I can get information from any source almost around the world. In about 30 seconds, you can be exposed to really great stuff and vile stuff that 30 or 40 years ago, you'd have to sneak around to find and do it in the dark and hope nobody would see you. Why in the world would you put this into the hand of a teenager that has not yet fully developed moral conscience and needs to be trained? Now, I don't think you ought to keep a cell phone away from your kids because this is the world they're living in. This is their world. But as they get age appropriately old enough, and I think that will vary from child to child, you have to measure the maturity, you have to teach them and put some restrictions up, but I guarantee you any kind of restriction you put on a cell phone can be defeated. Just understand that. It can be defeated. You're going to have to help them navigate it and teach them and train them, just like driving a car. You don't keep them from behind the wheel and throw them the keys when they're 18 and expect them to figure it out. You got to teach them. And I think we've got to teach our children how to use technology because this is their world. We're not going back. But please do not give your 12, 13-year-old a cell phone. If they need to stay in touch, get them a dumb phone. Get them a phone that they can make a phone call with. But don't get them a smartphone. You're setting them up. Predators today are genius. They're genius. And they know how to take advantage of children. And I would plead with parents not to do that.
I would say, too, pardon the cough drop, part of the reformation that the teen's brain goes through is impulse control, and they have very little of it. So if they have to have a phone for some reason, lock it up at night. They don't need it at night. They don't need to be calling or checking anything at midnight. So be sure that you are the one that's in control of that phone until their brains are fully formed at what, 50?
Yeah, 45.
I feel my brain forming right now. Hold on,
Yeah,
we're conferring.
I was going to say that, yeah. I have two quick things to say on that. One is that when you finally believe that a child has a maturity to handle something like this, and you've explained things and you've guided them, when you actually do give them the cell phone, you ask them to go to their bedroom and lay the cell phone on the bed and get down on their knees and pray, Lord, please give me the strength and the grace never to sin with this cell phone, to use this only for causes of righteousness and good. And that prayer is remembered in their conscience, can be a help. At the same time, I think as Tom was saying, you can't protect a child from everything. And if you get overly protective, there's also a danger that the child will get very resentful and angry. Everybody else has a cell phone my age. I'm the only one left, and my dad and my mom are just very cruel, and you create bitterness, and then when they get a cell phone, they'll misuse it. So there's a balance here. There's no one straight answer. This is the age, or you got to look at the maturity of the child, the self-control of the child. For example, when our son was young, he wanted a gun very badly. He wanted to go out hunting, but he was a kid that he had bow and arrows out there. He'd leave his bow out in the yard. He'd leave his arrows out in the garage, and we said, you cannot have a gun. You cannot have a gun until you know how to put away properly the other things that you have, because it would be dangerous. Did we ever give him a gun?
He never got a gun until he was married.
Was this the high maintenance one or the?
Let's not go into too much detail. But actually, Fraser Jones, who's a TA I have now, he and I are actually, I'm getting deeper into this. He and I are writing a book on how to respond to digital technology today in the framework of Reformed systematic theology. So this is such a comprehensive subject. We're looking at it in terms of the 6 loci: the knowledge of God, knowledge of man, Christ, salvation, the church, and the last things. And showing how digital technology, every part of theology has something to say about its use.
I think there's a really good book, too, and somebody will know this. Is it 12 ways your phone is it 12 ways your phone is changing your life? That would be good for everybody that has a smartphone to read.
And that came out like iPhone 7.
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, and we also published a book last year by Jeff Johnson, I think it was, Taming Your Fingers. Yeah.
Here's one about marriage. How do you and your husband handle finances? Do you discuss it on a regular basis?
I don't have a husband.
Praise God.
He earns the money, and I spend it.
Amen, sister. We're on the same page. I think it's an ongoing conversation.
Yeah, in some marriages, this is a huge problem. Huge problem. And it's usually a huge problem when one of the two people don't really know how to control their money. Some people have a very careful budget, and you work it out together, and you implement it. And one person who's ever most gifted takes charge of it. In our particular case, we never did work on a budget, did we? But
he works so much we don't have time to spend money.
My wife doesn't spend money or doesn't waste money, so it just happens all very naturally for us. I say, honey, you can go spend as much as you want, anywhere you want. Don't worry about it. It's up to you. Let your conscience be your guide. That's perfect.
But I'm Dutch.
Don't listen to him, okay? Don't listen to him.
And she says to me, look, if you feel you need books for your study, I'm not going to supervise that. And I'm careful, and she's careful. We really don't spend much money at all. But it's an easy thing for us. But when you have people when one partner always wants the next toy, and then wants a motorcycle, and then wants a cottage, and people can throw away a lot of money, and it's actually become sinful when you keep acquiring so much stuff that you could be giving more to the church and to the poor and to the needy. I think then you really need a careful budget.
What we've done is, over the years, we've had very tight budgets where, everything was line item. But over, the last several years, we've developed where, okay, we have priorities here. So number one is giving. We're going to give this percentage of our income, no matter what the income is, high, low. This is off the top. We're going to save. So we're going to have a savings for this. And we're going to have savings for automobile expenses because we know our cars are going to break down. They're going to need to be repaired on things. And so we have that there. We've got bills we know that are going to need to be paid. And so we want to allocate money for that. And after that, we don't get really tight on where's the money going to be spent. But we do talk about it, and I feel the responsibility. I think it's my job as a husband to make sure that we're not getting out of whack. But with that, there have been times when we've said, look, we need to increase our giving, or we need to increase our savings here. We got this coming up, and trying to make sure that when we do those things, if we've got money left over, we'll go out to eat, or we'll do other things as well. But these are the basics. We're going to make sure that these things are taken care of, and giving's always at the top. That's always number one.
And Tom's really good about, and has helped me with this, to think forwardly. It's not just about the money you have right now and what you're going to do, but what are we going to do in the future? With when we get older. And
too late.
Also, we need to remember that if you have means that okay, the New Testament doesn't say you have to give exactly 10%, right? There's more freedom there. Some Christians abuse that and say, well, I won't tithe at all then, and I'll just give my leftovers to the Lord. That certainly is a wrong attitude. Actually, in Israel, if you look at all that they had to give, the typical Israelite was probably giving 25%, maybe even 30%, with the support of all the Levites and stuff. So we've actually taken that approach, like 10% to the church is minimal. And then, we want to support. I want to give donations every year to RHB. I want to give donations to the seminary, of course. And I want to give donations to special projects in the church. And whenever I come to Mary and say, can we give an extra 100 here or an extra 500 here? I've never had time yet in our marriage where she says, no. She says, actually, she always says, yes, of course. Yes, of course. I love it. I love your generosity. So that way we're both on the same page. Where you get in difficulty is when one person is extremely thrifty and the other person spends money like crazy. That's where you got to really have a budget and work it out.
Can I add just a side note about teaching children about finances? We followed a pattern that a family from our church followed, and our kids had a paper route at a young age because that's the only job they could have, like no age restrictions. So every month or so, we'd add up their paychecks and their allowance, and then I'd get it all in cash, and we divide it 10% right off the top goes to church, and they would choose what they wanted to give to charity. So they were putting their own money that they earned into the collection basket, and I think that's important. And then we always said 35% goes straight into the bank, and they couldn't get it out till they were either going to college or getting married. And then 35% for spending, and they took a lot of care in deciding that. And the remaining 20% was either for gas or car when they got older, or a little bit for clothing. They didn't like that because they didn't like to spend money on clothing. But I thought, well, we've got to prepare them for supporting themselves. And books. There was always a certain amount for books. So that when
5% they had to go to books. And when they got some money, we would walk over to RHB. We'd get on the floor when the store was closed, and we'd pull all these books off the shelf. I'd get the kids really, really excited. And then we'd come home with a couple books, and then it would build up and build up and build up. And when our oldest daughter was about 13 years old, she said, "Dad, I've got a question for you. How come when I go over to other kids' house, they don't have a bookcase in their bedroom that's full of books? Where are all their books?" We all have. So that's great. We wanted all our kids to be readers. That's one reason why we never had TV at our home. We just didn't want them sitting in front of that box. We wanted them to be readers and fill their mind with good things.
So I'm hearing that you would not recommend that husbands and wives have separate bank accounts?
No, absolutely not. Yeah, and teach your children. I mean, what you just said is right. Teach your children to handle money well. My mom taught me to give, and so there's never been a day in my life where that's been a struggle. It's just I counsel a lot of people. I'm sure you have too. They think we just can't give. We don't know how to give.
Yeah,
that has never entered my mind. From my earliest memory, if I had $1, then some of it was going to be given. And so I praise God for giving me a godly mother like that.
That's a good point.
and they experience the joy of giving.
Yeah,
That's what I got to tell you a quick story. I'm going to keep it very anonymous, but there was two men who were both very wealthy, and they both loved the seminary, and they both lived in the same area, and they were very good friends with each other, and they were really blunt Dutchmen with each other, right? And I knew them both well. Both very kind men, very godly men, very generous. They had a big heart for the seminary. And one guy would just always give a tiny little bit, tiny little bit. And the other guy would give a lot. And so the guy who gave a lot told me one day, he actually told me this. He said, my friend, I told him this. You're not giving very much to the seminary, and you should be. You really love it. You should be giving a lot more. You know what the problem with you is? Well, I get to give with a warm hand. And you know when you're going to give? When you can only give with a cold hand. Yikes. But that's actually what happened.
Wow.
That's exactly what happened. So when you give, Jesus said it is more blessed to give than to receive. You get more joy out of giving than receiving. And so when you can give to really worthy causes, that's so rewarding.
Amen.
And you can say, wow, my fruits have gone all over the world when I gave to that cause, the fruits of my giving. I've had a part in that. If you wait till you die and it's just in your will, you never get to enjoy it.
Do your giving while you're living so you're knowing where it's going.
That's good.
Did you just make that up?
I've never had an original thought in my life, so I'm sure I didn't make it up.
All right, final question, again on parenting. What advice would you give to parents who are feeling burned out by the daily frustrations of parenthood?
It's real. Talk to each other. Hopefully you have a supportive spouse that you can talk to each other. Go on a date together, go for a walk, get some exercise. Hopefully you can get more sleep tonight. It's a marathon. It's not easy. And prayer, just hang in there by God's grace.
Yeah, and get some help. Find a friend. Maybe you can trade off some childcare responsibilities, or if a grandma lives nearby, call grandma and say, I need a nap. Can you come take the grandkids? So, yeah, we're, have a community. That's what the church is for. What's that?
Ask for help in the church.
Yeah.
Yes. Don't be afraid to ask for help. It's not a sign of weakness. I think it's a real sign of strength.
Also, in addition to all these really good ideas from the ladies, when people ask me, what would you do different if you had to do it all over again? I say, worry less and trust God's covenant mercies more. And when our kids would get into a stage, kids go through stages, and that's what burns you out. When they go into a bad stage, I think you think there's no end to this stage. And we had it with one of our children when he was like 5 or 6 years old. Came home from Christian school every day with tall tales. I mean, total lies. But the child's imagination was so vivid, we didn't know if the child really believed that these things happened. It was very confusing, but I thought, well, if this child lies like this at 5, what's a child going to lie like when he's 20? I mean, I pictured him sitting in jail, and And then what I learned gradually was just keep being consistent, trust God's covenant faithfulness, and he'll come out of that stage. But don't panic. So worry less, trust God more, and whatever worries you do have, turn, as Mary says so often, worry is actually good for me because I turn them into prayers. That's the one good side of worry.
Yeah, it's a season, and parenting is tough. It is tough. And we ought to, as a church, and as older guys, we ought to try to encourage those that are in the throes of it right now. We should do whatever we can to encourage them. But if you're in the throes of it, it's a season. It'll be over before you know it. And God's called you and given you a wonderful, wonderful opportunity to do what you're doing. You're doing some of the most important work in the world. So don't beat yourself up that you feel frustrated. Take the break. The world won't stop turning. Your kids won't turn out bad if you take a day and say, hey, we're not going to do much of anything today except just you go outside and play, and I'm going to stay in here and read a book or something like that. And those things are okay periodically. But the community, the friends, the church, if you think you're kind of losing it, or if you think that you just really don't have any more end to your rope, then yeah, reach out. There are other people who have been where you are, who are where you are, and who love you, who will help you and care for you. So don't hesitate to ask.
Can I just say a couple more things? So I think you'll all talked about the fact that we're in a war. It's a spiritual war. Parenting is a spiritual fight. You're in the trenches. There's the fog of war. It's real. You're raising little warriors, little arrows that you're going to launch. So it is incredibly difficult. Build into your day and your routine time to exhale and to breathe a little bit. We had an hour after lunch where the kids, just from the time they were little and napping, that was kind of a quiet hour when they were all readers. We had the deer hour where you drop everything and read. And we were in a small house with 6 children homeschooling on top of each other all the time.
Wow.
So the other rule was you have to go be by yourself for a little bit. So it was good for them to kind of have that quiet time and decompress a little bit. And that gave Mommy time to nap if she needed to, make phone calls without interruptions. We had rules about what would justify an interruption, like active fire,
blood,
or blood flowing blood, not just a little bit of blood. So you have to find things like that. And then Tom would talk about intentional neglect sometimes. So it's okay to leave your kids in the care of somebody else that you trust and go grocery shopping by yourself, or go on a date night. That's okay. That's good for kids to know that they can survive without you and even thrive in those times.
And keep sort of a thermostat and a feel on the love in your heart. If you feel the love for your children growing cold, then it's time to reach out and ask for help. And if there's no help available, just when they finally get to bed at night, just go in that room and look at them, because there's nothing more beautiful than a sleeping child, especially when they've been wild and crazy during the day, and just look at them until you feel that love returning.
And sometimes you may need to go get some real biblical counseling to help you. Yeah.
And I would add, as one with small children, for those of you who don't have small children, or maybe your children are grown, more than just being the person that can come alongside and give wisdom and advice, also be the one that can come alongside and watch the kids for a little bit, because to be able to get away and get some rest is very important as well. And that's one way that church is really a blessing.
Yeah.
Well, thank you all very much for this time, for answering these questions. Give our speakers a round of applause.